It's a notorious, unsolved murder since 1987. Welsh private investigator Daniel Morgan was found dead in a pub car park, having been killed with an axe.
Well, the Metropolitan Police is now accused of institutional corruption because this thing's been going on for decades after an independent report claims that the force continually protected itself after several failed investigations into Morgan's death, which was a very, very murky story to begin with. Home Secretary Priti Patel calls these findings deeply alarming, and she's not wrong. But this isn't the first case of police corruption, as Kira Durkin reports.
Well, joining us now is retired Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, Sir Peter Fahey, who says the British police are one of the best in the world and need to protect their reputation, and former Detective Chief Inspector at Scotland Yard, Mick Neville, who says there is a culture of secrecy in the Met. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. Let's talk to Mick Neville first, because you were formerly at Scotland Yard. This report is absolutely damning of the Metropolitan Police. Institutional corruption. The panel said there had been suggestions since 1987 that Daniel Morgan, the murdered man, was going to sell a story about police corruption to the media. The nature of that corruption was never established. It just is utterly shocking the way that this was originally investigated, and the criticisms of the police go all the way up to the present day. What do you make of those criticisms of institutional corruption in the force in which you used to serve?
Well, it's obviously very disappointing. I mean, I know that the vast majority of police officers are honest and decent, but the problem is at the top. And it's this definition of corruption from the report. The corruption they're talking about is not people taking money. It's where senior officers are told by a junior officer there's something wrong. And rather than sorting out the problem, they attack that officer. I personally witnessed this on myself and officers under my charge. So where an officer exposes wrongdoing, whether it was me with CCTV or other officers on other major inquiries or about the way the police record crime, rather than sorting out the problem, they would attack the officer by trying to discipline them. They would delve into their private lives. They would try to move them or shut down the unit, rather than get a grip of it. And whilst some would say, well, some of these things are a long time ago, you know, I only retired 4 years ago, and I know this sort of thing goes on now. It is not the junior officers, it's the people at the very top who then protect themselves and don't sort out wrongdoing. They're more concerned with reputational damage than serving the public.
But this is real line-of-duty stuff. It's a very complicated story, and it's taken me a day to get my head around it, actually. But it seems to be kind of like this. The guy's murdered because he's about to blow the whistle on corrupt policing. We think it's probably something to do with drugs. He's murdered brutally. From the off, on day one of the case, the police investigation was a bit of a joke. They didn't even properly examine the scene of crime. They didn't do a forensic examination at the scene of crime. And from that point onwards, it became obvious within the force that something bad had happened and needed to be covered up. And it's like a row of dominoes. They just haven't stopped tinkling down over the decades. And therefore, there must be dozens and dozens and dozens of senior officers, either at the Met now or previously at the Met, who are in on this.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think there's two types of corruption here. I think in the late 80s, when this happened, there was certainly some collusion. We see it in the report between Detective Sergeant Sid Fillery and other officers and the people all involved in this, and the incompetence, or was it incompetence thing? Was it deliberately done badly? And then the corruption sort of changes over time into this covering up of what went wrong. And rather than saying, look, went badly, badly wrong, the Met are more concerned with saying, how do we protect ourselves, than serve the Morgan family and catch the villains who did this wicked crime.
Yeah, just to go into some of those criticisms, the handling of the murder scene was totally inadequate. It was not searched and it was left unguarded. There's evidence some of those arrested in connection with the murder may have been alerted the day before.
What, you've been tipped off?
Yeah, by a leak to the media. There was another investigation in 1988 conducted by a different constabulary. The panel found that did not pursue evidence that serving or former police officers were involved in the murder. There was evidence of a culture within the Met Police which allowed a very close association between officers on the team investigating the murder and individuals linked to crime. I mean, it makes your eyes water, Sir Peter Fahey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sir Peter.
We know about this. We saw it all the way through with things like Guildford 4, Birmingham 6. I was a detective in the 1980s. It was an absolute circus. And the court system, the whole criminal justice system really colluded in encouraging officers to do unethical things. Since then, we've had the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. We've got the Crown Prosecution Service. We've got an independent system of complaints investigation. We've got the tape recording and the video recording of interviews. The system has massively changed. But on the other hand, what Mick Neville highlights about this sort of covering up, this failure of big organisations to tell the truth, we've seen that recently with the BBC. We've seen it with organisations like the Post Office, the churches. We see it, whether you like it or not, often with ministers trying to protect their reputation, they're rather telling the truth. And just, you know, forcing one police chief to resign won't deal with that. There is a wider issue here of creating a culture where big organisations tell the truth, are open about failings in the past, but policing has radically changed since the 1980s, and the very poor standard of investigations we saw in lots and lots of cases has radically, changed.
Sorry, but I just want to draw you back to the words from the panel. The panel says the term institutional corruption is being used in the present tense, not just about what happened back then. It criticised the current leadership because this panel was set up. It was supposed to take 12 months. It took 8 years. And part of the reason for that, they said, was that their work was slowed down because they were not given prompt access to the necessary records and computer systems that they needed.
So it's still going on right now.
And that's not right. And the Commissioner... The Commissioner needs to be accountable to that, to the Home Secretary and to the Mayor. But the fact is that sort of criticism, as I say, has been made of all sorts of big institutions over recent years. That does not make it right. It's appalling for Daniel Morgan's family that it's taken this long, and that needs to be looked into. But the fact is this whole culture of big organisations finding it difficult to actually be open and learn the lessons and be open with the public. But there are, as Mick said, there are two different forms of corruption we're talking about here. We're talking about what was a really damaging, really horrible culture in policing in the 1980s, really poor investigations that let victims down, and the culture we've got now in big organisations, as exhibited by this, where the leaders, through different political pressures, legal pressures, the complexity of the cases, find it really difficult to sort of navigate through these inquiries and try and be completely open with the public.
You're right, obviously, to draw parallels with other big institutions and the kind of cultural corruption that goes on there too, whether it's a bank or whether it's a media organisation. We've seen what's happened with the Martin Bashir story. But the police are meant to be different. The police are meant to be on another and higher level. Hang on. I just want to ask you, finish that statement with a question for you. What I don't understand is why an honest, high-ranking copper wouldn't want a bent copper to be rooted out of the force, because it's like a cancer that spreads through the force. Why wouldn't they want to cooperate with an inquiry and get rid of these people?
Richard, they do. Police forces put a huge effort into counter-corruption. Corruption is a problem in police forces across the world. I would argue it's, it has not been a particular issue of British policing, but you can never be complacent. Senior officers absolutely want to root this thing out. They want a completely open system. Officers like Cressida Dick have really driven systems for greater accountability, for greater openness, independent investigation of complaints. But policing is a difficult business. It's a complex business. It's affected by all sorts of other pressures, political pressures, societal pressures, and I absolutely would agree, and lots of senior officers have called for a fundamental review of policing because at the moment it feels pulled in all sorts of different ways. And absolutely, as Mick Neville says, the problem with this is these sorts of cases really damage the morale of frontline officers in this day and age trying to do their best in a really difficult situation. Yeah,
and Mick, we have a situation where policing is done by consent. We need to trust police officers. And as you say, while there may be bad apples, unfortunately, you have then a force where other officers may feel tainted by the outcome, by what's been said. But the bottom line is a man was brutally murdered. And over decades, his family do not know what happened to him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we must feel for the Morgan family and we must want this killer brought to justice. And I think Richard's point is very valid, that the first people who should be obeying the law are the police. The public should expect that. I can assure the public that the vast majority of officers are honest and decent. What's really needed is a change in leadership. The current leadership in the police is not good enough. It's colluded in this covering up things, and it needs to change, and it needs to change now.
So you're obviously calling for Cressida Dick to go, are you?
I think it's fair. How do you stay in a position when you've been criticised so personally? I've no doubt she's a very, very decent lady. But what the mistake of not allowing that, or deliberately not allowing access to those documents or that home system, the computerised policing system, why in God's name would anybody do that? If you're a senior officer, surely you want this crime solved. If it was me, I would have given every access to the inquiry team. I just don't know why anybody would stop that. It's just crazy.
So people who say that basically she wasn't even in the Met when this crime happened and when the initial cover-ups happened, you would agree with them, or you would agree with those who would argue against them and who say, yeah, but on her watch, while she has been in charge, there's been this foot-dragging in these investigations, and that's why she should go. Yep.
Absolutely, Richard. So the criticism is not to do with 1987, it's to do with her time as an assistant commissioner, which was a very high-ranking position in the Met, and documents or computerised records weren't released to the inquiry for at least 8 months. Why would that be? I just cannot understand it. As Peter has said, that every police officer, your job is to catch villains, particularly those who are really evil and wicked, and put axes in the backs of people's heads. They need to be caught. And why would you stop the documents being released?
All right, Mick Neville, thank you very much indeed to Peter Fahey. Thank you. The Met says it deeply regrets the failure to bring those responsible for the murder of Daniel Morgan to justice, except corruption was a major factor in the failure of the first investigation. They say the force is now transformed. And Commissioner Dame Cressida Dick said it's a matter of great regret. Our mistakes have compounded the pain suffered by Daniel's family, and for that, she apologises. She says she's been personally determined the Met provided the panel with the fullest level of cooperation.
OK.